Hey YouTube, how you doing? It's Max. It's currently the weekend. We went and worked out today. Julia made some hummus, so having some peppers and hummus as a snack. Today I want to talk a little bit about bias, cognitive bias, which is kind of a broad category. I think that most people are generally aware of what bias is. And if you've never heard of bias, then I'm glad you're able to find this video and learn about what bias is. Essentially, bias is our innate reaction towards something, whether it's in support or against it. Usually, it's a thing or a person or a group of people in a manner that's seen as prejudiced or unfair. And I think that the common conception of bias is, generally associated with prejudice. It's generally um, considered bad. We usually think of prejudice as, being prejudiced against someone's race or gender or social status. And so I think that we can generally agree that, having bias is bad. However, I feel like, I would like to argue that we are constant, like, while we are aware that bias is bad, we are consistently showing bias on a daily basis. And you know not only this, but like my personal life, I think that it's a good skill or a good um you know habit to try to be aware of your own personal biases and try to mitigate them as much as possible. And so I think that, like, why even try to mitigate bias in your life? I think that, like, which I think, that it makes sense to I think it makes sense to like try to mitigate it, but like there is no reward for, living a bias free life, right? Like, it's not illegal to have bias in your life. For the most part, like, you could be biased towards certain foods, you could be biased towards certain musics, you could be biased toward a certain political party or people of a religion or non-religion, or even, like, people who are fans of a certain sports team and are biased towards other people of a sports team. Like, generally speaking, like, this isn't really like anything that's illegal to do. But I think that we can all kind of come to a conclusion that it's not really socially preferable if people are biased. So, like, I think that, like, for me in my life, life's a journey, of journey of self-discovery, self-improvement. And I think that, like, I associate, like, trying to mitigate your own biases as trying to be someone who's being open-minded. You can kind of see your own flaws when you're kind of analyzing your own biases. And I think that for my benefit, at least, I think that it's beneficial to, try to be mindful, I guess, of this. So it's not really like for any reward. It's not to try to get out of doing something illegal. I think it's just, for me personally, being the best person I can be is to try to mitigate my own bias. So in this video, I kind of wanted to talk about cognitive bias because I think that this is a concept that really resonates with me. And I'm going to add a link to in the description to a video that kind of demonstrates this a bit better than I can currently. So I'll put that in the description, as well as another video, or it's not really a video, it's more of a website called verywellmind.com that kind of lists out these 10 types of cognitive biases. So I'm going to be really talking about this in the video, just kind of like reading from this website and kind of like maybe commenting here and there. But if it's something that you want to take a look at and read, I encourage you to do that if you're interested in, kind of understanding more about biases, cognitive biases, all that stuff. So cognitive bias, I would define that as kind of like, and this is actually a definition I found, but kind of ad-libbing it in a way. Cognitive bias is pretty much like this processing error in our brains. Uh, we tend to, our brains want to simplify information and filter information. Life's very complicated, so we want to simplify and filter it. And, pretty much all of our knowledge is built on personal experience and preference. So using this information, we aren't really able to be omnipotent or omniscient beings. We're very, you know, uh, we're very infinite. Like, yeah, we're very finite, not infinite. We're very, very finite beings with our own personal experiences. So we're prone to having a lot of cognitive bias. And so, in the video that's in the description, this guy kind of this is just an example of like how he kind of explains cognitive bias. In the video in the description, he kind of goes around to people and asks them, um, to try to figure out the rule to this string of numbers that he presents to them. So he'll present something, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something along the lines of 2, 4, and 8. And it's like, what is the relationship between these numbers, and can you figure out how like the string of numbers continues essentially? And so most people are like, oh, you just multiply by 2 because 2 times 2 is 4, and then 4 times 2 is 8. And he says that's correct, but that's not what I'm thinking in my head. And the rule that he's thinking in his head is essentially, as long as the numbers are increasing, then it follows the rule he's thinking. And this kind of highlights this cognitive bias in a way, because while both parties are correct, it kind of showcases how we can have these gaps in communication between ourselves based on like our prior experience. And you could write this off as like, oh, it's just a troll trick question, ha ha ha. But I think it's really interesting to consider this concept and how cognitive bias can impact your life, and especially in this realm of communication. And I think that this is applicable, all the time between you and a friend, or you and a family member, you and a coworker, where you're arguing about something, and it might be something minor, and you're in this position where you're clearly you think that you're correct, and you just want to teach and educate this other person that you are correct. And then oftentimes these miscommunications, when we actually stop to really consider each other's perspective, you kind of realize how stupid the argument was the entire time. And it's just like, in the moment, you just have so much, I guess, like pride and bias in the context of that situation. You start to wear these like lenses, like these things that sort of blind you from the peripheries. You're so like tunnel visioned on this one like argument. So I think that like just understanding these biases can really help your life, and just helping you navigate through these conversations on a day-to-day basis, and ultimately can like set you up in positions to where you just kind of have a more, I don't want to say like a more profound perspective, because I don't want this to like sound like, elitist or anything. But I just think that it's, I guess, a healthy mindset that can really prevent a lot of strife or negative consequences in life, when you can understand your own kind of flaws and biased perspectives, if that makes sense. So in the description, there's going to be this website that explains these 10 types of biases. I'm just going to go talk about them quickly, just so, just to, I guess, entertain you. You can go read them yourself, but this is just going to be me like talking about them a bit. So if you're interested, stick around. Confirmation bias is the first one, and confirmation bias tends to be you listen to information that you already agree with. So, like, if you were about to watch a debate on gun control or something, whether it's, one side is for gun control, one side is anti-gun control, you know, uh, what the, gun control arguments are. And typically, most people will either be like, yes, we need more gun control, or some people will be like, no, we don't need more gun control. And if you watch that debate, typically you have a preconceived like perspective of the situation, and you'll just naturally agree with the side that has arguments that you agree with, rather they presented them in ways that are good or not, or their logic is sound or not. You'll just tend to agree, and that's pretty much what confirmation bias is. And so this can like apply to your life, because like if you're scrolling through social media, like we live in an age where we're very prone to advertisements kind of creating these advertisements, kind of feeding us information we want to hear, and especially in this like age of like political kind of division. We start to live inside of these echo chambers, and so understanding like what kind of news sources that are really you're being exposed to on a daily basis, who you're hanging out with, just all these kinds of ideas that support your pre-existing views can reinforce this confirmation bias. And so it's essentially living, I don't want to say like blindly living life without like mostly just like if you live a life without understanding what confirmation bias is, you're just kind of prone to not really understanding any of the perspectives of the opposite side that you don't agree with, and you start to kind of otherize them, and you just don't really consider all the logical arguments that pertain to that conversation, and you just kind of behave irrationally. And so that's kind of confirmation bias. Going into number two is hindsight bias. And hindsight bias is really like, I'm sure you've heard the term like hindsight before, like hindsight's 2020. It's really like the I knew it all along phenomenon. So let's say you're watching like a murder mystery or something, and the criminal who the murder is revealed like at the end of an episode of Scooby-Doo, and it's like, oh, I knew it was that person, but you never confess that you actually knew the person, or maybe that was like your second guess kind of option. And that's kind of like these what happens is you once the real like answer is revealed, then all these kinds of clues start to flood into your mind, that kind of explain the I knew it all along phenomenon. And this is typically caused because we have an interest in preserving our opinion, like our appearance to others as being these like capable beings. So we're able to like predict events. And this is also like, when you're gambling on like a horse, or, saying you flip a coin up in the air and you're predicting the result. It's kind of just like this, like even if there's no logic to being able to predict it at all, we have this feeling of wanting to, I guess, be intelligent or to win, and to just preserve our appearance, I would say. So that's hindsight bias. Anchoring bias, this is typically influenced by the first piece of information that we hear. So if we're hearing two different sides of the argument, typically if we are, listening to the first person, and it makes sense, we tend to, think that that is accurate, and then we are kind of less inclined to really believe the second person or the third person, etc. In this conflict, is kind of like similar to like that gut reaction phenomenon, where like, I don't know if you've kind of had this experience, but you're taking a test, and usually people say to trust your gut reaction when you're taking a test. And so this kind of conflicts with that, because on one hand, when you're taking a test, they say, trust your gut instinct. When you're doing anchoring bias, they're kind of saying the opposite, and don't always trust blindly the first piece of information you hear. And I think it's that like gut reaction that really is um, the thing, not to completely fully trust it or untrust it, but just to like consider that it's not like a logical, um, you know, it's not really logical to just immediately trust it without weighing in all the different options, and that's kind of like going back to the definition of cognitive bias. There's that thing of like showing prejudice. So you're kind of showing prejudice to um, the other like second, third, fourth, etc. options, because we're clinging to the first one too strongly, and that's, I think, kind of what it means. So like we're typically the most prone to anchoring bias when we're in like a bad mood, or we've been primed to expect a certain result, or especially as we're kind of like what is it, when our attention spans are kind of getting shorter, that kind of stuff. So we can kind of expect, it's, I guess what I'm just trying to say is like, just be mindful of anchoring bias. Don't always pick the first thing you're given, but I don't know, you know what I mean. Anyway, going on to the next one, misinformation bias. Bias is a overdependence on testimony or memory, I would say. So a person who experiences like a traumatic event, like a car accident, right? They might have a memory of what's happened that's crystal clear, but research has suggested that we tend to be susceptible or influenced, and that can change how we remember certain events. So asking carefully worded questions it can really change someone's memory of what happened. And this is kind of one of those things like when you get pulled into interrogation rooms, if you've heard the thing where it's like always ask for your lawyer when you've been like, put into custody. uh, some of the questions can be primed in ways to like, well, I guess this wasn't on the website, so it could be completely wrong. This is just how I'm interpreting it, but um, pretty much asking carefully worded questions can just kind of change someone's memory of what happened. Or and also like watching the news or documentary can report a certain event and how people have like remember an event. So like if something happened in the 90s and you live through it, and then you watch like a news report or a documentary on something that happened, that can also change how you remember the events as they played out. And pretty much this new information fills the gaps in our memory that we may not have all the information of. So we like to kind of, we might only remember like certain 10-second event from the thing, but we want to remember like more of like a story. So we'll fill in these gaps as we get new information. And it can range from like trivial to serious details. But an example of this kind of getting out of hand, the misinformation bias, is such as like if you were like a witness to a crime and you identified the wrong suspect in the case because you got misinformation later on down the line that you used to fill in the gaps of your memory, even though you saw the events taking place, that can still lead to the wrong person getting arrested for a crime. That's just an example. Anyway, moving on to the actor observer bias. This is our tendency to blame external factors on our success. So, like, if you were to do bad on a test or an exam, you might be like, oh, well, I did bad because I didn't get enough sleep the night before. And while this could be a factor, we tend to come up with these excuses since, if we don't get the desired results. Um, and this is pretty much to avoid putting all the pressure and blame on ourselves. And this makes more sense when you compare it to like how we judge other people. So when we judge ourselves, as I said, it's more of an external influence. But when we judge other people, it's more an internal influence. So if we put the same example, why did this person do badly on a quiz? Us looking at other people, we might see, oh, well, they just didn't try hard enough, or they, are just incompetent, and that's why they did bad on the quiz. But for me, when I do bad, it's mostly because I just didn't get enough sleep, or I didn't eat breakfast, something external. And so this is kind of similar to like the protagonist syndrome in a way. And there's another one that kind of also relates to this, but it's pretty much like, you know, we need to understand that there are many factors at play in these situations, and just describing only external factors to ourselves while only ascribing internal factors to other people, or vice versa. It's kind of can lead to us having a skewed understanding of what's going on. And then there's the number 6 is the false consensus effect. And this is our tendency to overestimate how many people agree with our own beliefs or behaviors, attitudes, and values. And an example of this is how this is kind of a personal example, but I've seen in many of my life, or sorry, I can't speak today. So if I were to describe this, it's just the idea that people tend to believe that other people already agree with them on issues, whether it be controversial. So my example for this is that when I often, you know, go hang out with like people that go to the same church with my parents, when I meet these people, these people often um, assume that I go to church with my parents. They assume that I'm Christian. And while, this is very easily understandable and easily forgivable, mistake to make, um, it's because people tend to spend a lot of their time with people who have similar beliefs, similar opinions. And, this is very similar to, like, let's say you're like, very liberal or very conservative or something like that. And you tend to kind of associate probably with a lot of liberals or conservatives, and that would sort of like change your perspective, your outlook on life. That most people you kind of interact with or see might also be, liberal or conservative or have the same religion as you. So it's just a very easily made kind of error, I guess, that can kind of occur in life. I don't know. And I think that this is kind of dangerous because it kind of starts to develop this tribe mentality. So you begin to like overvalue your own opinions in these, especially if it's a political or a religious. You tend to overvalue your own opinions, and then you start to undervalue the opinions of others who share different, opinions in these kinds of uh, I guess, aspects of life that you may hold very important. So I think that overall it's just good to kind of remember that there's other people in life that are probably don't agree with you 100% on everything, and might just be good to, assume not assume that people do that. I don't know. Next is the halo effect. The effect is this tendency for you, let's see. It's this tendency for an initial impression of the person to kind of influence what you think of them overall. So, I think an example of this that they used in the article is that if someone is good looking, you might automatically assume that they're like also an attractive, competent person. And this might also be, like if you see a celebrity, you might assume that they're, very competent person overall in every aspect of life, kind of thing. Or a political candidate, if they're very confident and aggressive on the debate floor, then maybe they're also intelligent or competent as well. And this is not necessarily true. I think another example might be like, say like your friend or your parent, you trust them a lot, and be, based on the fact that you trust them a lot, you might tend to believe what they say, even if what they say doesn't make a lot of sense. And this kind of has to do with cognitive dissonance and um, our desire to kind of not have a lot of cognitive dissonance in life. And what that kind of means is we don't want to have a lot of contradictory beliefs. So it's sometimes we get that like it doesn't compute message when we see someone who is like we trust a lot say something that we don't really agree with or something like that. And so we tend to give people that we trust the benefit of the doubt, or people who look like we can trust the benefit of the doubt, rather than to kind of analyze what they've said and look for proof to validate um, that our assessment of them is accurate. And I guess this is kind of like very similar to like if you were to look at an advertisement and people who use like a celebrity as their spokesperson, and we automatically trust them because we value that person as like a good member of society who is good looking or very talented, so naturally they are used to sort of subconsciously influence or sway us to buy this product because we can trust them, that kind of thing, for the halo effect. um, Self-serving bias, this is very similar to the one I mentioned a couple ago called the actor observer bias. And I would call this well, this self-serving bias is also very similar to like this protagonist syndrome thing or egocentric bias, in a way where we tend to give ourselves like extra credit for success, and then like other people not as much credit for successes if they did the exact same thing. So an example of this might be like, let's say you and your roommate are determining who's done more chores than the other, household chores like cleaning and stuff. And both of you think that you cleaned more than the other person. And, naturally, both of you couldn't have cleaned more than the other person. One of you would have had to have cleaned more than the other person. But we tend to fall into this kind of like trap where we tend to think that we've done more than other people because that's all that we really know. We don't really have a motivation to give people as much credit as they deserve, as opposed to us. Like, we want to um, protect our own self-esteem, and if others are faulting, that kind of builds us up. So that's kind of this self-serving bias where we basically just want to build ourselves up and prove to ourselves that we are competent individuals and uh, you know competitively better than other people, I guess, is self-serving bias. The availability heuristic is number 9, and this is the tendency to estimate the probability that something occurs based on how many examples come to mind. So, an example of this might be watching the news and you see all these different like car accidents or something occurring in your kind of town or community. And you think that, because there are so many car accidents that you're seeing on the news, that, people are bad drivers in your community, when this might, um, if you were to look at like a national database and like compare your area to other like places around the country, you might have an actual like very low accident rate or something like that when you compare it objectively. But because you're exposed to all these different examples on the local news of these car accidents occurring, you tend to think that people are just bad drivers where you live. And that's just like an example. And this is pretty much in our kind of cognitive, psychology, because it's like a mental shortcut that we use to save us time when determining risk in a situation. So, like, a lot of these just kind of go back to this gut feeling kind of instinct, and that your gut feeling could be wrong, and sometimes it's correct, which is good, but sometimes it's wrong, and that can be problematic. And this is also very relevant to the recent kind of events of COVID, where if you have never seen anyone die or get COVID at the early days of COVID, you might be less inclined to care about wearing a mask. And as we've known for the past couple of years, that this has had this kind of mentality has had a lot of negative impacts on our country and on the world as a whole. So yeah, that's just the availability heuristic. And then number 10 is optimism bias, and this is very similar. I would describe as ignorance is bliss. And it's kind of this mentality of not really caring about the consequences of a bad thing until it happens to you. So you could say that, the optimism bias is this tendency for us to overestimate the likeliness that good things will happen to us while underestimating the likelihood of bad things happening to us. And an example of this might be like, wearing a seatbelt or speeding in the car and being like, oh, I won't get pulled over for getting a ticket or not wearing a seatbelt, or worse, I won't get in a car accident and fly out the front window, because the chances of that are so low. But it's that argument of it only takes one instance for you to like completely change your world perspective, because the consequences can be so severe, the argument. But, you know, it's interesting too, because when you look at like some of the studies apparently that have been done on this, it's very hard to reduce people's, like optimistic or optimism bias, um, mostly because if people were to consistently think about the negative aspects in life, people overall might be less hopeful or less motivated. Um, and it's easier for people to just kind of ignore. That's where ignorance is bliss kind of comes from. It's easier to kind of ignore the bad parts of life, focus on the good parts of life, especially when you're, trying to think of like aspects such as like divorce or job loss or illness and death. There's risks to everything, and it's just like, do we want to value or not value? Do we want to spend time and energy kind of worrying about these things, or do we want to just kind of like, live our lives uh, to the fullest while we have life, and that kind of thing? So like, so what? Because like even that thing, it seems like, why even focus on some of these biases if it's just wasted time, wasted energy. And when I was giving the intro to this video, I was discussing how like it doesn't really matter if you choose to live a life with bias or if you try to mitigate it or not. Having bias doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, and many of these biases are like kind of inevitable. So like, is it worth um, investing all this time and energy to constantly be checking ourselves and evaluating every kind of decision that we make in life? That is, it free of bias, that kind of thing? And I think what kind of makes this this is just a very interesting topic because there isn't any reward to living a unbiased life. In fact, it's probably just more work, and then you're just more critical of yourself, all those kinds of things. But I think that like the goal isn't really to be super strict and live this bias free life. But I think the more important thing is to just constantly like just be aware that these biases do exist, and that it being aware just kind of helps us navigate, understand ourselves better, our attitudes and the behaviors that we're kind of making on a daily basis. And when we kind of understand, I guess, the biases that we have and these attitudes and behaviors, we can kind of understand all the different choices we have and our control in our own lives, and how these choices and the control that we have can play a role in how we are kind of seen by others, and in turn like the consequences of our own actions and choices, if that makes sense. So it's not really necessarily about like putting a hard rule on it and being strict and no biases ever. It's just kind of like understanding like, you know I'm experiencing this positive or negative consequence in life. How did I get here? And when you kind of are able to look at like the choices you're making, do I have biases? And I think that's just like a critical variable to just be aware of in your life, just to further understand, I guess. And life is very complicated, so this isn't meant to be you should be unbiased in your life. You should be, there isn't like a one size fit all guidebook, I don't think, that clearly details how to live the perfect life that's free of unbiased, that's, you know, perfectly always happy, And I think that if you think that there is this one size fits all guidebook, then chances are you probably have some biases in your life. And you may want to, further analyze that if this is something that you care about. But anyway, that's all I really have today. This felt a little bit kind of messy, but again, links are in the description to the video and to the article. And yeah, have a good one. I'll catch you in the next video. Later days.